telling us, as I remember the Osagie for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, that now, as you turn in your grave, if you had been alive, you'd possibly be 107 years today. But your people, some of them, in their lack of wisdom, chose to remove you from power. I apologize on their behalf. They gave you only a few years to be present in this world. And during those few years that you are present in this world, you shook not only Ghana, but Africa so very fundamentally that although your mortal remains were interred, your spirit is alive and well. And it's that spirit that occupies our minds and hearts today as we remind ourselves that the only way in which Africa will realize our potential is through the path of unity. I know as you lie in your grave, great Osagiefo, there is a sense in which, in a manner so completely invisible to us, you are turning uncomfortably and weeping uncontrollably because your continent is bleeding. One of the greatest Africans of the 20th century and whose ideas continue to remain relevant. We are, in my view, engaged in this exercise because we recognize that the ideas of the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah remain relevant today as they were during his lifetime. Many of you will have had the advantage of reading about the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. You may have heard and listened to some of the speeches that he made during his lifetime. You may have recognized that he was one of the very early Africans who, in the days of Pan-Africanism, was present in Manchester in 1945. And he was, in many ways, one of the greatest Africans ever to have carried the mantle of the struggle for independence in an Africa that had been laboring under the weight of neo-colonialism and subsequently colonialism. You may also know that the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah was one of the very few Africans in those very early days who was able to confront the imperialists and the colonialists and to awaken the spirit of freedom amongst his contemporaries. In fact, several polls that have been held in the recent past have had the Osagie for being recognized as perhaps the greatest African politician who ever lived in the 20th century. And what is amazing about him are that his ideas were as prophetic as they were relevant. You only have to read some of his writings, and some of you have had the occasion to read his writings, such as I Speak of Freedom. And in that great treatise, the Osagie from 1950s begins to talk passionately and consistently, not only about the freedom of Ghana, which was then known as the Gold Coast, but constantly reminding his audience that the freedom of Ghana would be of no significance if the rest of Africa was not free. You will remember on the day that Ghana regained our independence on the 6th day of March 1957, the Osagyefo was as passionate as he was eloquent in reminding Ghanaians to celebrate their freedom, in reminding them that they were celebrating an important occasion, but also reminding them that the independence of Gold Coast, then renamed Ghana, would mean nothing if the rest of Africa was not free. You will remember, subsequent to the independence of Ghana in 1957, in 1958, the Osagyefo and his administration convened a meeting in Accra, Ghana, at which meeting he reminded not only the political class that was present there, but the trade unionists who assembled that the most urgent business. When he made that statement, and he made it several times, he then posed the question, not rhetorically, of course, some say rhetorically, but it does not matter. When he asked, when we say, seek ye first the political kingdom and the rest will be given unto you, what are these other things that will be given unto you? And he then went on a journey of explaining to his audience, the things that will be given unto you are the dividends of economic emancipation. We are going to talk about economic emancipation because freedom of the political kind in and of itself is not an end. We are going to talk about how to eradicate poverty. We are going to talk about how to feed ourselves. We are going to talk about how to harness our resources. And he specifically mentioned we are going to ensure that our coffee farmers get their fair share of what they deserve. We are going to make sure that our gold does not benefit foreigners, but is going to be beneficial to the people of Ghana. We are going to ensure that we build infrastructure and roads for ourselves. We are going to ensure that we have electricity. We are going to industrialize Ghana. And he reminded his audience that the Ghanaians had a great duty, the duty to demonstrate to those who are in the business of doubting that Africans cannot manage their affairs, that indeed Africa could. And he was as consistent as he was passionate. But perhaps one of the greatest things that the Osagyefo Nkrumah did and said that will remain indelibly marked in the sands of time is the speech that he made on the 25th day of May, 1963. That was the occasion when the 32 heads of states and government of the then independent African countries, at the invitation of Ethiopia's Haile Selassie, assembled in Addis Ababa. And at that time, many of you will remember that the imperialist, whom the Osagyefo had rightly said does not change his character, but only wears different masks, had already started to animate their diabolical scheme of dividing the continent of Africa along what some described ideological lines, but in my view, they were simply a bunch of retrogressive counter-revolutionaries and progressive African leaders. You'll remember that that division was christened the Monrovia Group that was led by Tubman of Liberia and included, among others, Felix Houphouët-Boigny of La Côte d'Ivoire, who had been persuaded effectively, particularly by the French government administration of Charles de Gaulle, that Africa should not unite. And the more progressive group, which comprised the Osagyefo Nkrumah, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, Modibo Keita of then the Sudan, now Mali, and a little later people such as Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania and Kenneth David Kaunda, known as the Casablanca Group. And they were clear on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The Osagyefo was riding on the crest of what he had said times without number. he had said on a number of occasions that the situation in Africa is heartening and encouraging, but also disturbing. Heartening and encouraging because 32 African countries which had labored under the yoke of the colonialists were now politically independent. But disturbing because the erstwhile colonizer was already using some within the ranks of Africans to divide the continent. The Osagyefo had reminded the continent that African peoples may have diverse cultures and different languages, but their diversity was going to be the glue that was going to make unity a reality. He had reminded his audience times without number that indeed African countries that had been created in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 were unviable. They were too small. And if they persisted in their disunity, then they will be manipulated by the erstwhile colonizer. The Osagyefo was as clear as he was prophetic. He himself said that he was already doing the work of prophets without the gift of prophecy, but he had the ability, now history demonstrates to us, to take the pulse of the continent and to read it correctly. So that when he spoke on that day, on the 25th day of May, 1963, he was not the only speaker, there were others. And I can remember excerpts from a few of the leaders. I can remember Haile Selassie of Ethiopia reminding his audience that it was a momentous occasion that Africans were present in Addis Ababa. I can remember David Dacko of Central African Republic saying that he himself and his people were happy that they were now under a new administration which was led by the people of Central African Republic. I can remember Julius Kambarage Nyerere reminding his audience that they did not come to Addis Ababa to underline how important unity was, because unity was a condition sine qua non, but that they were coming there to cement unity. I can remember many of them saying great things, which are now recorded in history. But indeed, many have spoken, the 31 of them spoke, but the standout speech on that day was that of Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. He was as passionate as he was direct. He was as direct as he was right. He was as right as he was prophetic. He was as prophetic as he was realistic. And he told his audience, we are gathered here because we are independent. I'm paraphrasing the Osagyefo. We are gathered here. Let us be in the knowledge that the independence that we have regained was not given to us on a silver platter. The imperialist does not give anything for free. He does so willy-nilly. The Africans fought and sacrificed. That is why we are here today. We are here today because our people fought and sacrificed and recognized that the long-term health of the Black man not only demanded but required that we must be masters of our own affairs, that we prefer poverty in freedom rather than tranquility in servitude, the Osagyefo said. But he told them to remember that the neo-colonial project may have been terminated, but there was another project which was being manufactured in earnest, the neo-colonial project. And he said that the neo-colonial project was as pernicious, if not more pernicious, than the colonial project. He therefore told his audience, the only way in which we can immunize ourselves from the diabolical machinations of these shape-shifting neo-colonialists and imperialists is to unite. I hear the Osagyefo telling his audience, let us not leave Addis Ababa without forming a common government. Let us not leave Addis Ababa without agreeing that we are going to have one army. Let us not leave Addis Ababa without recognizing that we need one currency. Let us not leave Addis Ababa without recognizing and ensuring that we are going to have free trade. Let us not leave Addis Ababa without choosing where our capital is. And the Osagefo went on to hazard, he went on to say, if I was asked, Bangui in Central African Republic would be the capital of that new thing called Africa. And if not Bangui, Leopoldville, now known as Kinshasa. But he then said, my word is not final. My colleagues and the people of Africa will determine that. And he told them, let us not leave here, therefore, without having our foreign ministers convening a meeting at which they'll discuss all issues and report back to us. But they listened not to the Osagefo. They listened not to him. And what we ended up with was a success for the Monrovia group. We ended up with a watered down organization known as the Organization of African Unity. The story of the Organization of African Unity is known. We are not saying that it did not achieve certain things. I remember there are certain things that were done under the aegis of the Organization of African Unity, such as the struggle against the Smith regime in what is now Zimbabwe, or the struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa, or the struggle against the apartheid regime in what was then known as Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. I can still see them working in the struggle against the Portuguese in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique, and in Angola. But to a large extent, the OAU, as some have described, was nothing but a toothless bulldog. Or if it had teeth, the teeth were not sharp enough to liberate Africa from her economic woes. And if anybody doubted the Osagefo Kwame Nkrumah, no sooner had the dust settled in the gains that we had made via decolonization, and even earlier, we started seeing the dirty hand of the neocolonialists. How many of you present here will forget the murderous regime of the Belgians who took out Congo's Patrice Emery Lumumba? How many of you here will forget how the French took out Togo's Sylvanus Olympio? How many of you will remember how they manufactured coup d'etats? How many of you will forget how the Osagefo himself in 1966 was removed from power? How many of you will forget how Nigeria's Nnamdi Azikiwe was removed from power, and how Tafawa Balewa, the then prime minister, was liquidated, and the Sojourner of Sokoto's Ahmadu Bello? How many of you will remember how they treated Algeria's Ahmed Ben Bella? And one can go on and on, how the coups then became the way of neutralizing the gain that we had made. So the Osagefo was right. And we went and are still going through a difficult phase, a phase that vindicates the Osagefo. So vindicated was the Osagefo that in the year 2000, the African nations started re-examining the efficacy of the Organization of African Unity, and they agreed that they needed to go back to what the Osagefo had said. I remember so very vividly during the chairmanship of South Africa's Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, when she became the chair, she wrote an imaginary letter to Kwame Nkrumah, telling Kwame Nkrumah, we apologize to you, Kwame Nkrumah. You told us to do certain things in a certain way, but we forgot. But now that we have had the scales removed from our eyes, we shall retrace our steps. We shall not persist in our foolishness. We shall correct our mistakes and do what you prescribed to us 50 years before. And that is how the African Union came into being before she was appointed. And that is how we now have the African Union and Africa Agenda 2063 saying the very same things that the Osagefo had said. If you look at the Africa Agenda 2063 and listen to the speech of the Osagefo Kwame Nkrumah, it is a rehash of the same. If you look at earlier initiatives such as the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, it is the same thing that the Osagefo had said. If you look at the Lome Agreement of 1975, it is the same thing that the Osagyefo said. If you look at the